We're now going to take a look at some of the lighting and rendering options available within xStream and how they interact with Cinema 4D objects. The scene I have loaded in is just a couple of buildings. We have a building over here on the left and sort of an Aztec slash Mayan pyramid on the right. Technically, it would be a little more Aztec just because they tend to have built their pyramids over the Mayan pyramids, and they looked a little more like this one does. And I'm currently using the sun object within the scene. And in the xStream options, I do have the setting for the sunlight matching turned on. So things are going to work a little differently with this option using the existing sun as opposed to having view set it up automatically and using the view light. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a new scene. And if we expand our environment object, we're going to see our sunlight is exactly in the same place as our Cinema 4D sun. Now the difference is if we take a look at the view sunlight and in the attributes we take a look just underneath color we have the intensity. This is set to 0% and shadows are turned off. And this is part of the automatic setup. Now I'm using a really low render quality right now. I'm going to set in our options to have the render quality automatic. So it's based on the Cinema 4D sampling quality. And my render options in Cinema, if you take a look at the anti-aliasing, I just have it set to geometry, which is going to be very low quality anti-aliasing, but it is going to provide a quick preview. And that's really what we're paying attention to right now. So we can go ahead and render this in the view, in the main viewport. And immediately you're going to notice there's no ambient light. Our shadows showing up on the view ground plane are about half of what they would normally be because we have ambient light. And any view object is also going to show that ambient light setting. And that's because of the settings in the atmosphere editor. I'll just go ahead and load in a view sphere. Go ahead and create one. Make that a little bit larger. And it's just slightly intersecting with the ground plane. We'll go ahead and render that again. And you can see that the diffuse lighting is completely different. Our ambient light coming from the sky is showing up on the view object, but not on the cinema object. And this is going to happen no matter which light setting we're using. Now, before I go any further, one thing I want to do is create a terrain to match up with what we have for our objects, because it's missing the ground. And all we really have are these couple of walls and the buildings. There's kind of a cool trick to get the terrain to match up really well, and also kind of get a sense of where these objects are in the terrain editor. So what we need to do is switch to the 4 viewport mode. And first I want to create the terrain to establish the size so we don't have to try to match it up later. So I'm going to create a standard terrain. We'll go ahead and set our scale, making it larger. And we want just enough to fill in a little bit around the buildings and of course the walls. And I do want to reduce the preview quality So we'll go to our xStream options, and I'm going to set the geometry quality of the proxies to low. And that way we should be able to see a little bit better in the viewport. And it looks like some of our other display options really not going to work too well for this. So we'll just go ahead and take our terrain and move it below our ground. The main thing we want to see is the comparison of the objects to the outside of the terrain. And I'm going to edit the object with our terrain selected, reset it, and click OK. Should give us a nice flat plane. And what I can do is just drag that a little bit above the ground plane where we have our walls. And now I'm going to open up the right view and just zoom in. And we can see the different elevation levels we have of our walls, also where the stairs are going through the different sections between the walls. But what we want to do is use an image to define basically our terrain and its height. But we want that image to be as close as possible. So I'm just going to zoom in a little bit more, just so we can see exactly where all of our elevation levels are. And we can pretty much see everything in this small section. Because we know the building and the pyramid elevation are exactly the same. So I can go in here and now what I want to do is just hit print screen. And that's going to copy the screen. If you have another method of capturing this, go ahead and use it. But now what I want to do is paste this into Photoshop, and we're going to take a look at just setting up that elevation map. So now I have this image pasted into a document in Photoshop, but we do need one more screen capture, or you could do a render, pretty much whatever you want to get the reference. So I'm just going to go back to Cinema really quick, and I want to switch to our top view. And we just want to get the entire terrain within the view. And we'll just go ahead and keep that selected to really create a nice separation. We can turn off the axis if it's getting in the way. We'll go ahead and bring that over into Photoshop. And now I'm just going to crop out just the viewport, because that's really all we need. And we might need to make the image a little bit larger to match with the size we want to be using for the elevation map. But the current size we have will be good for a reference to start with. So even though there's going to be a little bit of pixelation in this image, it really shouldn't affect our height map we're going to be creating. So what I want to do is change the image size. And I'm just going to change the height to 2048. We'll probably end up changing that. But for now, that should be a good starter. And I'm going to select the bicubic sharper to see if I can keep some of those nice sharp lines in there. And it looks like that should work out pretty well. So what we need to do is go into our first layer and basically create an object or create just a rectangle with the rectangle tool. And I'm going to change our color to white. And we just need to draw out the extent of our elevation. And I'm going to be separating the main buildings from the rest of the elevation if I'm going to use the buildings as more of a reference rather than the actual elevation. I think actually I'll go ahead and just include that as part of the elevation. We'll go down to the bottom where we can see we have our ground plane just a little bit below the terrain. And then up on top, we're just going a little bit above the buildings because we have a wall and then some stairs and a couple of different zones that are showing up. I'm going to go ahead and right mouse click on the layer, rasterize it. We can double click to open up the layer style option. I'm going to select gradient overlay, and I'm using just the black and white, which in this case is the default for me because of the settings I already have. But if you need to, you can select the black and white map, reverse it if you have to, but we want the black on the bottom because we're creating an elevation. We want to make sure the scale is at 100% and we have this aligned with layer. Linear, 90% angle, and all of that is just what we need. I'm just going to create a new layer, select these two, putting the new layer underneath the shape, and just use Control E to merge those together. And now we no longer have the layer style, but we're not going to be needing that anymore. And now I want to create a couple of guides so that we'll be able to just keep that layer on and not have to worry about the sampling. And if you don't have rulers turned on, you can go to View and Rulers. But I'm going to select from the ruler, pull it down. And that might need to be changed depending on where I have the bottom elevation. Of course, this is going to be black, so it's not really going to matter too much. I'll go ahead and create another one for the top. And just while creating the guides, I'm going to reduce the opacity of that layer. And I just realized there is one set of walls over on the right side of these stairs that are not showing up in this image. So I'm going to go back and just grab another element, pasted it, and matched it. So I've just added that elevation, matched it up on the right. So we can continue creating guides. And then we're going to create one at the top for the main ground. And I just need one last one in between the set of stairs and the other wall. So go back and increase the opacity. And now I have that top view. And what I'm going to end up doing is just sampling the color from where the guides are showing up, and then drawing out with more squares in that color within that ground area. So I'll just go ahead and do one of them really quick. we're going to grab the elevation over here on the right, which is this ground section in between these two walls, just right here. So all we need to do is select our layer, select the eyedropper tool, and then just sample that area. Select our rectangle tool, and then we can just draw that out to go in that area of the ground. And basically I'm just going to be doing that for all of these sections. This is going to be really helpful because we're going to be able to use some of the erosion effects in the terrain editor to create some pretty cool looking interactions with the cinema objects and avoid the setup of creating individual terrains for these sections or ground planes. Typically the Z depth won't really work all that well for capturing this elevation, just because either the amount of time it takes to set it up or the range and the different heights is too far beyond the color level. So this method ends up being pretty quick, at least for this setup. It might be a little bit different depending on the scene you're working with. So I'm just going to go ahead and just finish this up really quick. So now I have the elevation levels basically planned out, and I have done the stairs as well, just using a gradient overlay, using the lowest color and then whatever color it meets with. And all I need to do is overlay this other image. I've gone ahead and merged together all of the elevation layers, and I'm just going to crop out right at the very extent of the terrain and just go ahead and zoom in right up to the edges. So we can see that and get it as close as possible. And then all I need to do is save this out, and then we'll be loading it in as elevation data. So we'll turn off that layer, and now I can go ahead and save this out and load it in to Cinema or into xStream. So now what we can do is, with the terrain selected, I'm just going to go to edit the object to open up the terrain editor, and I do want to increase the resolution. We'll go ahead and start with 1024 by 1024. That should be pretty good. Although for the initial image, I think I will go one step higher, because then I can always scale it down later, because that is going to be a pretty decent chunk of geometry, and I might not need that much. But just for the initial capture of the picture, I'm going to go ahead and just use this amount. So we're going to go to Picture, and now we can select to load. And once you select the image, it will load in. The placement, you could find out exactly where it needs to be positioned, but we can also just position it within the interface as well. The mixing proportion doesn't really matter too much, because we are still going to have to scale it on the up and down axis to get it to fit. So just go ahead and click OK, and now we have this nice little bit of elevation for our ground. Go ahead and click OK, and it does look like we are going to need to just rotate this around. So we'll just switch to the Rotate tool, hold down Shift to constrain, and now all we need to do scale this to match up. And it looks like I may have had one of the stairs up a little bit too high. We'll just go ahead and take a look at where we had placed our reference images. Looks like that needs to move down a little further. And I'm just going to scale this back up a little bit. So if we need to go back and do any editing with the image, could do that to get it to maybe match up a little bit better. Because this is a pretty decent scale. It really depends on how close you're going to get. What I could also do is use the blur tool on the image in order to kind of blend some of the areas where I want. But for the most part, anytime we edit the object, we're going to see exactly where the elements are. So this can be really helpful for getting a terrain to conform to any buildings you have in the scene. So that can be really important. And it looks like my staircase is a little bit too high where it's meeting the object and the pyramid. But what I can do is just go ahead and we're going to take a look at some of the erode tools. We could use some diffusive erosion to smooth out the edges so we don't have such a pixelated look. But another reason I did the staircases and getting some of the areas around that to blend is because we can get some nice curvature moving into the wall objects. And if we go back into the terrain editor, now any of the effects or erode tools that we have will really create some neat transitions. So we could go through some of the different effects available, and because of the resolution I have for this terrain, the effects might be rather small, where we might want something a little bit larger. In order to really get that to happen, we need to decrease the scale of the terrain. So you can end up saving an extra copy if you want, in case you end up destroying what it is you're working on. I'm going to go ahead and reduce this to 1024 by 1024, and then go back and use some of these tools. And we can see a much greater effect. But we could add some nice cracks in there if we wanted to. And you can really just do what you want with it. Paint on it if you want to. I'm just going to do some simple effects here. And we can see we have that nice blend into the walls. And depending on where your elevation was for the buildings, should have a nice curvature there as well. You can really get as precise as you want within the image to get a more accurate result, or maybe a little better of effect. I am going to bring down those stairs a little. Right at the top here. So I'm going to go to the paint, change the size, and set this to dig with a very low flow. And just kind of pull that down. And that should be good. And that looks pretty good for that side. And we'll come over here to the right, remove that area. And now over by the building, We also had a problem with that staircase, so we can dig that out, move that down lower, click OK, and now those intersections are gone. So having the building there within the terrain editor, so now it's underneath the object, but when we open the terrain editor, we have a really, really nice example and reference to where the buildings are. And if you want to create a little bit of a better blend around these edges, you can. And it looks like we might have too much of a separation. I might want that to overlap, so we might need to either paint that in or scale some things larger. I'm going to go ahead and stick with this for now, so we can get back to some of the more important aspects of using xStream with Cinema. So what I want to do is just load in just a starter material for this. So I'm going to go to Change Object Material, and under Material Layers, I'm just going to select Large Scale Pale Grass. Now, with this loaded, it does have a built-in alpha, so we will need to edit the object material. And it looks like it may have ignored the alpha automatically, and it did, so that's good. Normally, when there's an object, especially these layers that have built-in alphas, Vue will ask you whether or not you'd like to ignore it, but it looks like that's only going to happen when you're loading a material through the object properties. I'm going to reduce the scale to 50. And we do have one duplicate object being created, or a duplicate material proxy, which can sometimes happen. If we run into any problems because of that, hopefully we don't, but what we may need to do is kind of save the object, load in a different material. We'll have to see how that plays out, but you can see that we have two objects that are the same proxy because of the way that was edited. So typically you want to stay with the same editing method, but because I use the object properties rather than editing the object material, that caused a little bit of a problem. So that's one thing to pay attention to. Go ahead and just save what I currently have. And I am going to remove the ground plane now and just create a quick render. So now we're going to take a look at a couple of ways to get this ambient light back. There's a couple of different methods we can use for this, really depending on what you have available within Cinema. But first, let's take a look at what it is that's causing this difference and how it affects the view objects so that you know what to match up. If we take a look in the atmosphere editor, under light balance, we have an ambient sunlight slider. What this does is increase the amount of ambient light in the scene, which also decreases the density of shadows, and setting this to 100%, click OK. That is going to remove all of the ambient light and increase the intensity of the sunlight itself, where we can see now the ground is just extremely bright. So any view object is going to really intensify. So that sort of light balance is something that needs to be compensated for within Cinema. Because you really don't want to have to go through all of your materials of your Cinema objects and add some sort of ambient light shader to them. That's just not very practical. So we'll go back to the atmosphere editor, and I'm just going to set that back to 50, which is the default. And this method works best when you're using the view sunlight rather than the sunlight we have. The exact match is not carried out completely into view, it's mainly a placement and then an editing of the main sunlight. So what we do need to do is copy a few settings over. What we need to do is grab the color, so we can go to the General tab and we can see the color that we currently have. And I want to move that color over to the view sunlight. So we'll just need to remember these values for the RGB. If you're using RGB, really whatever color method you're using, although view only has certain levels of color that are available, so you have to pay attention to that as well. I'm using just the RGB mode. So just going to the object properties and editing the sunlight color, we can set it to that color. Click OK. And this still isn't showing up within the scene. So we need to increase the intensity, set our shadows to ray traced, and this color shouldn't impact the scene too much. We might need to copy that over as well so that it is affecting the cinema objects correctly. But for the most part, that lighting should be taken care of within view as the volumetric. So now we can go to the sunlight, and I'm just going to turn it off. So that's our native cinema sun. Just going ahead and switching that off, and we'll go ahead and see how that's going to turn out. So the color on the buildings looks a little better now, and on the ground it's matched to that blue color that wasn't carried over. So now what we need to do is fix the ambient light. If you're using the advanced renderer, you can turn on global illumination and use radiosity. There are a few drawbacks. For the most part, it works really well. But there are a couple of things, light bouncing back and forth between objects that may not show up correctly. We'll take a look at that in a sec. First, let's take a look at what we would do if you don't have access to the global illumination feature and just kind of creating an ambient light. So what I want to do is add in one of the cinema lights. We're just going to select infinite light. I'm going to rename it ambient. And under the settings and the attributes, we're going to select the ambient illumination. And I'm going to take our intensity and bring it down to 50%. Underneath scene, we have the ability to exclude objects. So what I want to exclude is the entire view scene environment. So what we can do is select that view scene and drag it into there, making sure that you don't have any of your cinema objects within that container. What we also need to do is match the ambient light color with the view color. But let's go ahead and just take a look at what we currently have and see how that's going to show up. And you can see the ambient light affecting the scene. If we're not to exclude the view scene, then it's also going to add that extra light to the view objects, which we don't want to happen. Now, unfortunately, this doesn't look very good at all. We'll definitely have to decrease that ambient amount, but for the most part, really, you're going to get the best effect from global illumination. Let's just go into that ambient light. I'm going to just decrease the intensity a little. We can see that showing up. And let's just take a look at using View's radiosity. I'm also going to go ahead and just switch to the camera since I am just using kind of a perspective mode at the moment. So we'll go back into the atmosphere editor and we can select radiosity from the lighting model in the Lights tab, and I'm using the Spectral Model. One thing I want to do just to speed up renders, it's still going to give us a really good idea of what we're working with, is just turn down our quality boost to, let's go ahead and bring it down to negative 1.9. So it's not really going to work for a final render, but since we're just kind of checking light balances in a very rough level, that should work fine. So we'll go ahead and render this out, and what it's going to do in the background is render view's indirect lighting pre-pass first. And I also want to note that canceling the indirect lighting pre-pass doesn't always work. So you may have to really make sure you want to render with the radiosity. For the most part, there's just a bit of lag, depending on the scene, really how that calculation is going to be interrupted. For the most part, we're really not seeing a change from the radiosity within view. A lot of it has to do with the initial setup of the different lights. But let's go ahead and take a look at how GI is going to look on here. I'm going to turn off this ambient light, and in the cinema render settings, under effects, we're going to add in global illumination. I just want some very basic settings for this, something that's going to go quickly. I'm going to set the samples to low and the density to preview. And if we take a look at this calculating, we can see the light from the view scene affecting the objects. So that environment is carried over. And you can already see just a drastic increase in quality from the ambient method to using GI. And you can even see the light and the green from the terrain showing up on the walls. So we have a really good transfer of that radiosity information over to the view volumetric and applying that to the objects kind of back and forth. And really the biggest problem you're going to run into is getting cinema objects to show their light on view objects. That sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Typically when you're using the view radiosity setting and you have that turned on and the global illumination is turned off in cinema, then the objects transfer quite well back and forth. But once you turn on the global illumination within cinema, you tend to run into some problems. So that's definitely one thing to pay attention to, whether or not you need to create separate passes and then kind of composite that together. It really depends on the scene and the setup. And with this scene, there's really no need to have radiosity turned on within view, at least for this current setup, because we're getting the information we need from these objects to run global illumination within cinema, and it works quite well. So we can go in and turn that off, use the global ambience mode to still keep the lighting correct on the ground. And we're going to see pretty much the same result, except it is going to render quicker because we don't need to calculate the view pre-pass. So even with the low calculation I have set up for the GI in cinema, it still looks pretty good.